Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Marie McNeely, your host for the People Behind the Science podcast. Thanks so much for joining me today for episode 623 with our guest, Dr. Autumn Lynn Harrison. Listeners, if you like this episode and you want to check out more stories from phenomenal people doing great science today, you can find more episodes of our show on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Spotify, and lots of other podcast platforms. And today, Autumn Lynn has some fantastic stories of her own to share with all of us. So get ready to meet another one of our outstanding people behind the science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to be speaking with our guest scientist, Dr. Autumn Lynn Harrison. So, Autumn Lynn, welcome to our show today. How are you?
Thank you so much, Marie. I'm doing great.
Well, we are excited to learn more about you and the wonderful work that you do, but I'd love to start by telling our listeners just a little bit about your background first. So, listeners, Autumn Lynn is Program Manager of the Migratory Connectivity Project and a Research Ecologist at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center. She is also an adjunct assistant professor at Duke University and an affiliate professor at George Mason University. Autumn Lynn received her bachelor's degree in environmental science and fisheries and wildlife science from Virginia Tech. She received a graduate diploma of science in tropical marine ecology and fisheries science from James Cook University in Australia. And she received her PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Autumn Lynn worked for the Society for Conservation Biology for 11 years prior to accepting a postdoctoral fellowship with the Institute for Parks at Clemson University. She then joined the team at the Smithsonian Institution in 2014. And Autumn Lynn, today we're excited to get to know you, of course, scientifically, but also more generally as a person. So can you start by telling us what you like to do when you're not doing science?
Absolutely. I've always really loved paddling and being on the water since I was pretty young. I grew up on the Chesapeake Bay. So I love canoeing and kayaking. And I got my first kayak when I was in high school from Survival Products in Salisbury. So shout out to Salisbury, Maryland. I really loved that boat. I also started playing music when I was pretty young and even directed the marching band at Virginia Tech. So I still play flute and piccolo in a community band in Annapolis, Maryland, and I still love watching college football.
Oh, fantastic. Well, it sounds like you've got quite a bit to keep you busy when you're not doing work, but I'd love to talk about your work as well. You were doing some fascinating science there. So how do you describe your work to people who might not be familiar with what you do and your field in general?
Well, I study the migrations of animals, and I use this information to help manage and conserve them. I use tiny tracking tags that use technology like the GPS on your phone to discover where animals go and what habitats and places are important to them. I often point to the Discovery Channel programs about the amazing migrations of East Africa that are so famous to put this work in context, but I mostly study marine animals. So those migratory journeys, I think, are something that a lot of people are aware of and can relate to. And so as a scientist, I feel pretty lucky to be able to talk to non-scientists about things that get them as excited as I am about what I research.
I love it. And I know, Autumn Lynn, you've studied everything from those wildebeest migrating to seals to birds. Do you have a favorite animal migration or migrating animal?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I love animal migration in general. And my interest in migrating animals definitely did start in East Africa during a study abroad during my undergraduate degree. But these days, I really enjoy studying marine predators. There's something about how voracious and acrobatic they are that isn't very much like my own personality. Mm-hmm. So I think it's just fun to work on something that is so different than myself. And I've been studying these groups of seabirds called Jaegers that are kleptoparasites, and they steal food from other poor seabirds. So they have this pretty gnarly behavior, but they're beautiful, sleek birds that migrate from the Arctic region all the way almost to the Southern Ocean. So they've been really fun to study.
That's wonderful. And Audubon, when you talk about it, your passion really comes through. And I think having this motivation, being inspired and excited about the work that you do is really important for science. And we love talking about motivation in general on the show. So I'm curious, do you have a favorite quote or a saying or just something that really motivates you in life and science?
Well, growing up on the eastern shore of Maryland, which is full of tidal marshes that sometimes flood low-lying coast and islands, a quote that I refer back to time and time again is one from the shore. It's called "The tide always changes." But it's funny, I tend to think about this quote most frequently when life is hard, knowing at some point that the tides will change and things will get better. But when life is easy, I tend to completely ignore it. So it's kind of a motivational quote of convenience. But I definitely turn to it thinking about those natural cycles that I'm just so familiar with, but that motivate me in daily life too.
Absolutely. Well, a fantastic motivational quote there. And I know as a scientist, not only do you get to do really cool work, you get to work with some phenomenal people. And these people can be great sources of motivation and inspiration and just fun as you go through your career. So, Audumlin, when you think about your own experiences in science, are there particular people who motivated you or inspired you or really helped you get to where you are today?
There are so many people. I wouldn't be in this amazing job being able to study animal migration for a living without so many people. But I want to give a shout out specifically to some women role models that I had when I was quite young. Many of the women in my family felt education was really important, loved reading and learning. But in high school, I was part of an environmental competition group called the National Envirothon. And we learned about wildlife and aquatics and forestry and soils. And we competed as part of a team. Well, this was the early 90s, and I was the only girl on the team. But 2 of the 4 topical experts were women, a wildlife biologist from Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge and an aquatic scientist and educator from an environmental lab. They were named Maggie Briggs and Kathy Baptist. And I think why I highlight them is that from the time when I was quite young, it was very normal for me to see women in these roles as a wildlife biologist and an environmental scientist. And there were a lot of outdoors women where I grew up. And so it was just perfectly normal to pursue the career that I did. And I never questioned that I could pursue this career. And I think back to that time, and if, like my teammates, the rest of those scientific advisors had all been men, maybe I would have felt like a complete outsider, but they really were role models for me.
Oh, I love that. And I love the name, the Envirothon competitions. That's awesome.
Yeah. I think it's still going today.
Oh, wow.
It was a pretty nerdy thing to be involved in, but I actually made a lot of friends from around the country through that competition. And all of us were just nerding out on nature. So it was great.
That's wonderful. It sounds like you had this passion for science, for the environment, for nature relatively early on. You mentioned this was in high school. Where did that start for you, Audumlin?
It did start very young, although I toyed around with wanting to be a fashion designer, and I still really like fashion, and a history teacher like my grandfather. So I have this passion for making things, for sewing, for creating, for the humanities, for history. But above all, I loved nature and loved being outdoors. And my family has been on the Chesapeake Bay since the 1600s. My dad grew up on a little island in the bay where my grandmom still had a house, and I would spend summers. And so out of all the other things that I loved, it was just always there and something that I always knew to pursue as a career.
That's really cool. So do you still get engaged with sewing and making things and sort of that creative side of yourself?
I do, yes. I actually worked as a graphic designer for a number of years. I worked for a nonprofit called the Society for Conservation Biology. And I was program manager, but when I went back to school to pursue my PhD, I had at that time started dabbling around in graphic design and annual reports and conference branding and things like that. And so I kept a part-time job during my PhD as a graphic designer. And that is a skill that is really useful for science, for creating compelling visualizations and communicating using methods that might be a little more creative than we normally get to do as a scientist.
Oh, absolutely. So how did you find this position at the Society for Conservation Biology?
I was the third person hired by SCB, which is what we call it. It's a professional society for conservation biologists, and it had been volunteer run throughout its entire history since the 80s. But when I finished my master's in Australia and moved back to the States, an executive office had been formed in Washington, D.C., and they had hired an executive director and a membership coordinator. And then I was the third person hired really to just be a generalist. I did a lot of membership management, talking with people about their subscriptions to the scientific journal Conservation Biology, helping them get registered for conferences, and supporting the work of the Board of Governors. That was amazing because that was a whole other set of role models for me, these amazing people that wrote my textbooks in conservation biology during my undergraduate degree. And suddenly I was helping them get their materials for a board meeting. And they were kind of like this one big group of aunts and uncles, and definitely supported me when I went back to school for my PhD.
Very cool. And I'd love to back up to your undergraduate degree. You mentioned you had this really great opportunity to do field work that maybe sparked your interest in research as a career. So can you walk us back to that point and talk a little bit about this?
Sure. I went to Virginia Tech for my undergraduate degree and started off with a degree in environmental science. I thought I would be an estuarine ecologist. I had grown up on the Chesapeake Bay and had volunteered putting out oyster spat and restoring oyster reefs and catching crabs. And so I really thought I was on track to be an estuarine ecologist. And then I did a study abroad with the School for Field Studies in Kenya. And the focus of that study abroad program was wildlife management, but primarily of migratory species. And seeing those migrations in action, counting huge herds of animals, and also becoming aware of the intersection between social science and natural science and the many tensions that exist in conserving animals while also maintaining livelihoods for people. This was the first time that I had been exposed to this outside of the United States, but it was very reminiscent of growing up on the Chesapeake Bay from a waterman's community where the resource was also very important to livelihoods. So I think that's what first grabbed me for animal migration. I really love travel and meeting people from cultures that aren't my own. And so that's one of the things I love studying animal migration, is that they connect us across the planet. These migrating animals, they are a shared resource for all of us. And I really love that in that way, they are just this symbol of working together across the planet to save nature.
Oh, well, this sounds like a phenomenal study abroad opportunity. So was it intimidating for you then as an undergraduate student to sort of pack up and study abroad in Kenya so far away?
Absolutely. I had never been outside of North America. I had been on a trip to Canada, and I wasn't from an academic family. My parents didn't have passports. I had never had a passport. And this was not something that was part of my background growing up at all. And I think my parents were pretty nervous, and I had to raise the money for the program myself as well, because I was on mostly scholarships as an undergraduate. So there was a lot involved in this. And my best friend at college was also admitted to the program. And so it was really nice to have her to go through this with, Casey. But yes, it was very intimidating. Even just flying through the Brussels airport to Kenya was an extremely new experience for me. But living in Kenya in a grass thatched hut, that wasn't intimidating. I loved being in nature. So that was all great. But it was definitely the travel and just being outside of North America was all new.
Certainly. And then you went all the way to Australia for your master's work. So what brought you there?
That's a good story, what brought me to Australia. I probably wouldn't have gone without my high school history teacher, Shirley McWilliams. She was the president of our local Rotary Club as a service group, and she was aware of a scholarship program called the Rotary Ambassadorial Scholarship. And the goal was to really send people around the world sponsored by the Rotary for different degrees, but to create goodwill among different countries. And she cut out a clipping from a newspaper advertising the program. She sent it to my mom with a little note that said, "Get Autumn to apply for this."
Oh, wow.
And my mom mailed it to me at Virginia Tech, and I applied. when Mrs. McWilliams told you to do something, you did it. So I applied for the program and went through an interview process and so on. And had to pick a school where I wanted to study. And I picked a few different options, and then the Rotary narrowed it down for me. And I was sent to James Cook University to study marine ecology.
Oh, very cool. What was it like there for you?
Oh, it was beautiful. It's funny. I lived in a town called Townsville, which was about 100,000 people at the time. And for me, that was the biggest place I ever lived. It was like a big city. It was so beautiful, tropical. And I lived in an international dorm. So almost all of us were from countries around the world, and about 25% of the students were from Australia. So it was just this really beautiful experience there.
Phenomenal. So then how did you find your way to the Smithsonian eventually?
Yeah, it's funny. I traveled all the way around the world to come back to not very far from where I grew up.
Right.
And I would never have dreamed that I would be working at the Smithsonian or the National Zoo. These were places that were big field trips for me as a kid. We would take one big field trip in elementary school to the Smithsonian from the Eastern Shore and visit the museums. And I never knew that a zoo could be a good home for a person that works out in the wild. And I've really grown to appreciate the role that zoos and aquaria play in being that last line of defense for conserving some species, but also creating the techniques and information to help prevent species from becoming extinct. So it's been a really neat place to be. But to get here, I had to get a PhD first. That was required for my job. And I completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Clemson University, and then saw this job announcement for a person to study migratory birds and to lead a big project to track birds across the Americas and discover unknown migratory journeys of birds. And so I applied for the job, and I've been at the Smithsonian about 6.5 years as a research ecologist.
That is phenomenal. And I know you've worked on some really cool projects over the years. So Autumn Lynn, is there one in particular that you have going on right now that you are just the most excited about and you want to tell me and our listeners more about?
Well, sure. This project that brought me to the Smithsonian is called the Migratory Connectivity Project. It was founded by Pete Mara, who was the head of the Migratory Bird Center at Smithsonian, to use this ever-evolving tracking technologies, becoming smaller and smaller, giving us the ability to track smaller birds to discover unknown migratory journeys. There's been about 100 years of systematic bird banding in North America. So this is attaching a little metal band to the leg of a bird, and then maybe that bird is resighted later, far away in a different country even. And that gives us an insight into their migration. But now tiny little tags are small enough to be carried by birds and to track their movements throughout their entire migration. One study that I've been leading is to study the migrations of a shorebird called the black-bellied plover. They're very handsome. They wear little tuxedos like James Bond.
Oh, wow.
And over 100 years of studying the species using metal bands, there were only 2 or 3 resights of birds that were banded. So we knew very little about its migration. And now we have over 50 different migratory tracks across its entire range in the Americas. And we have a pretty good idea about how the different populations divide into different migratory flyways across the Americas. So since 2014, we've learned so much more than the prior 100 years of history of studying those species.
Oh, that's fascinating. And you mentioned these tiny little tracking tags to give me and our listeners a sense of scale here. How big are they, or how much do they weigh?
The tiniest tags that I use are about the size of a little Tylenol pill or an aspirin pill. Those are used to track some of the seabirds I study, like the Arctic tern, which makes the longest migration of any animal on the planet. Even the biggest animals, the whales, the Arctic tern is the champion. So we attach these little tags to a leg band on the bird's leg. We also use solar-powered satellite tags that weigh about the same as an American nickel. And those are carried by perhaps medium-sized shorebirds or larger-sized shorebirds. And they get recharged by the sun and then transmit the data to us by satellite. So once the tag is deployed on the animal, we can go back to our computers or our phones and get constant updates for where that bird is.
That is remarkable. Thank you for sharing more about a project that you're working on. And you've made it all sound like so much fun. I think most of us are ready to join you. But I know there are tough times too, Autumn Lynn. Every science field has challenges. So for you, has there been a moment where it just seemed like everything was going wrong or you had a major failure that you had to work through? And if so, can you tell us more about it?
There's lots of minor failures for sure, and a couple major ones. But when I have failed at science, for example, all the tags we deploy decide they're not going to work. That's a pretty big bummer. It's a waste of dollars. You never want to work with animals and then have the science not pan out because that's really a waste of possibly interrupting the bird's schedule. So that's never a good thing. But that's all part of science. I would say I had some pretty down moments during my PhD. And I think many of us have had this experience where it's just a really big mountain to climb. And I wasn't sure if I'd be able to do the project I wanted to a few years in. And there was a time when I thought my project was being scooped. And there were so many personalities involved and levels of competition among people working on the project. And I was just a graduate student. So I was pretty worried that I actually would be able to finish my PhD. I wasn't grounded in academia. I didn't really know what I was getting into in terms of academic culture. When I was growing up, I only knew one person with a PhD, and I just wasn't prepared, I think, for what academia was really like, and grew up in a place that it wasn't a common thing. So anyway, I had some times when I was pretty sad and upset and felt like an outsider.
Definitely. And I think so many PhD students and postdocs and even early career faculty go through these tough times like you've described. So for you, what kept you going? What kept you from walking away?
A few things definitely kept me going. First, I was passionate about the work I wanted to do. I never lost that. And I still haven't, wanting to do something mission driven. And I try to finish what I start. So I had always been completely enthralled by animal migration, and that really kept me going, never losing that passion. But second, I'm glad that for me personally, I had worked in between my master's and my PhD. And I kept thinking, what would I do as a professional in these moments when things seem unprofessional in the academic world? Or if I was going to tackle this in a job environment, what would I do? And my boss at the Society for Conservation Biology, Alan Thornhill, he gave me that advice. He said, think about this the same way you would accomplishing a job, and don't get too wrapped up into all the other things that could distract you. So that really helped me take a step back out of the culture of academia. And then I guess the final thing was that, also related to my job at the Society, I had some really wonderful working relationships with a group of women there. We were all about the same age. And one of my coworkers was also pursuing a PhD. She was working full-time and doing her PhD part-time, and I was working part-time and pursuing a PhD full-time. And remembering that I had such a great working relationship with these women who were my peers, and they were also in the field of conservation, reminded me that maybe my academic experience was just kind of a microcosm and not really a reflection of the broader world or even a reflection of myself. So it was helpful to have friendships outside of my immediate PhD life and women that wanted to lift me up through that process. Those three things really kept me going.
Oh, wonderful. Well, we're so glad you made it through those dark times, but we don't want to focus on them specifically for too much longer.
No.
I'd love to talk about successes as well, Autumn Lynn. I know you've got so many to celebrate. Do you have a favorite success story you'd like to share, whether it was a big win or a small but particularly meaningful one?
Well, a couple of recent successes, and one is just kind of this extension of working toward a mission-driven field in science that after I finished my PhD work and published a paper that I really wanted to get published because it was important for management, I was then asked to present that science at the United Nations at treaty negotiations to craft a new treaty for the oceans. And that was a really meaningful success for me to think that the work that I had done actually would be relevant to this new treaty and management process and reach a group of policy makers. That was just a dream, really a goal for me, that that's the kind of science that I would be doing. And I was given 8 minutes to present my science to that kind of general assembly room at the United Nations, where they've got the country names and people are wearing interpreter little things over their ears. And that was quite a surreal experience, but one of those great moments. And then the second success is a recent one. We recently received funding at the Smithsonian to create a new collaboration called the Shorebird Science and Conservation Collective, the Shorebird Collective for short. And we've been funded to support this process of people working on tracking shorebirds all over the Americas to contribute our data to be used currently for conservation and management. A lot of our discoveries about shorebird migration are happening now. So it will be 3 or 4 or even 5 years until they're published and available to be used. But through the Shorebird Collective, we will be working to avoid scooping anyone's work, but still make sure those data are available for conservation and management. And so far, we've received data from over 30 different collaborators for 34 different species of shorebirds. So this is a huge conservation and science success that we are all coming together, many different organizations, to share current data on shorebird migrations for their conservation.
That is phenomenal. Well, congratulations, Autumn Lynn, on both of these very exciting successes. And I'd love to step back to the first one you mentioned. I think presenting to the United Nations sounds quite daunting. So what was going through your mind when you got that invitation?
Oh, gosh, it was facilitated by some people that I knew. So I had been part of some workshops and groups to bring these data together for the treaty process and had been participating in these initiatives for a couple of years. And when the time came for the treaty negotiations to open up, this is really by invite only, and you go through the security process and badging process. So the group of folks invited me and thought that my recent paper would be really relevant. And I really couldn't believe it. I mean, and honestly, the first question in my head was, what am I going to wear? It's the most ridiculous thing, but this is the United Nations. What do you even wear to the United Nations? And again, not being really a city girl, this was new for me. But yeah, I was just so pleased and nervous, but had a lot of folks that I knew. A lawyer that has been working on high seas conservation for a long time. She was a great champion of my work, and some other folks that helped me out. Some familiar faces there for sure.
Definitely. And I think for a normal occasion, even just a scientific presentation, kind of packing in everything you want to say into a short amount of time is a challenge. But for this, it seems like the stakes are even higher. How did you get it down to just 8 minutes?
That is where that graphic design background really helped. I was able to show slides, and I chose to use a series of infographics with very succinct messages to share the primary conclusions of the work. And so rather than using a lot of charts and things like that, I tried to simplify the messages and show them in a visually appealing way to convey the science, because that audience is composed of many non-scientists as well. So that helped when I thought about the visuals that I wanted to show. That helped guide the content.
And I'd love to touch on the Shorebird Collective as well. It sounds like this is a phenomenal project and one that really has international reach and is engaging a lot of different collaborators, as you said. Is it difficult, I guess, to coordinate everybody and to kind of work across all of these different borders and boundaries?
Yes. And another key aspect of the Shorebird Collective is just gaining trust and assessing everyone's level of comfort with sharing data for this purpose, and making sure that they know our aim is not to publish data out from under them. So I had been guided by other initiatives that I've been involved in. BirdLife International has had a longstanding initiative for seabird. So that really inspired me that the time was right to do the same thing for shorebirds. But it took a lot of thought crafting a data sharing agreement, reaching out to the community of shorebird researchers and conservation managers through a series of webinars. So there was a lot of prep work to just hear what some of the concerns were, hear what the positive feedback was, and just wrap that into the process for moving forward. So We've hired 3 new people, and they'll be starting in September and October. And they'll be working with the data and connecting the data sets with existing management questions. So all of the work is about to start. And I will say I'm a little nervous. It's a big project to lead. But again, it's that kind of mission-driven science that will keep us going through this.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to following this project, and best wishes to you and the team on it as it unrolls here. And I know as a scientist, you spend a lot of time buried in the data, reading the literature, and sometimes it can be helpful to take a step back and read for fun. We encourage all of our listeners out there to do it. So, Autumn Lynn, do you have a favorite book or a few books you could recommend for us?
Well, I read a lot, and I read a lot of different types of books. I never grew out of my Nancy Drew phase. I think my first book report in the first grade was The Secret of the Old Clock. And Nancy Drew was clearly another role model for me of an investigative, independent spirit, I think. But one specific book that I really enjoyed as a scientist, and I don't know if this book was well received by poets, but it was a book called 10 Poems to Change Your Life. And it's part of a larger series of books by Roger Housden. I picked it up at a bookstore during National Poetry Month, and the first line of the book is, "Good poetry has the power to start a fire in your life." And I have to say, good science is like that too. So the book kind of hooked me right away. Well, the science poetry kind of analogy. And each poem is presented with an interpretation, providing a broader context for the work, kind of like the discussion of a scientific paper. And the first poem in the book is by Mary Oliver. So she's a poet of nature and human experience. And she talked about this journey, and I was studying migratory animals. And so the book just kind of reintroduced poetry to me. And I love the arts and history and humanities. And so it reminded me to take some moments and just reconnect with those disciplines and other ways of thinking outside of science. So I just really loved it.
Oh, well, wonderful recommendation. We will put this on our website for our listeners to find. And we touched on throughout our conversation just some of these opportunities that you've had to travel all over the world for your science. And I think this is part of the career that people may not realize kind of comes with it, even if you're not a field researcher. So we love talking about scientific travel. So Autumn Lynn, I know you've got a lot of choices here, but do you have a favorite place that your science has taken you?
I love traveling, and I travel a lot for both fieldwork and for conferences. A lot of my work now is in Alaska, and I've had some really memorable experiences there, working with people in Alaska, having a couple of bear encounters that get the heart racing. So those have been really great experiences. I lived in Australia, and I've traveled to Moscow and China and Argentina, but I'd say maybe my favorite experience, this is going to make my bird colleagues a little grumpy maybe, was with marine mammals in a diamond mine in South Africa. I was working with a large team of South Africans and Australians to study the migrations of Cape fur seals. And there's this De Beers diamond mine in northern South Africa that it's an alluvial mine. So the diamonds are in these kind of rivers that flow down to the ocean. And this entire stretch of beach is just closed because of the mine. And it's a Cape fur seal colony. We stayed in this kind of camp there and weren't allowed a vehicle. So all of our field gear was just camped in, and this miles and miles of beach of Cape fur seals with pups. And it sounded like a sheep farm. They're batting and barking. And it was just really, truly special to be kind of on the edge of South Africa amongst such like vibrancy of life and kind of a desert, but bordering the ocean. It was just beautiful working with some really great people to study Cape fur seals.
Oh, I love it. Well, how long were you there?
I went a couple of years. And so our field trips were about 10 days each. So not very long, really. And yeah, 2 years in a row.
Wonderful. Were you able to take a little bit of time to enjoy the beach as well, or was it mostly work?
Mostly work on that beach, but I did end up staying in South Africa beyond the field time. And one year I had a conference there as well and would stay in Cape Town for longer periods of time. So yeah, I love South Africa and have traveled quite a bit around the country.
Well, this sounds absolutely lovely. And I'll admit, you did pique my interest talking about bear encounters in Alaska. So I do have to ask about that as well. What happened?
Well, 2 stories, one with a brown bear and one with a polar bear. My very first time in Alaska, I was being welcomed to a field site by Lee Tibbetts. She is a biologist with the USGS. And she really welcomed me to teach me everything she knew about shorebirds. I had never worked with shorebirds before, and we were going to tag some black-bellied plovers. So we got dropped off by a Zodiac boat pretty early in the morning, probably 7:30, to tag a male black-bellied plover on its nest. And we're no sooner on the island, the Zodiac boat had left, and we hear this huge kerplunk. And we look across, and there's a grizzly swimming across the channel right at us.
Oh my.
We really hadn't even had sips of our coffees in our thermoses yet. And Lee, being an Alaskan, knew exactly what to do. Neither of us are very tall. I'm 5'3". We put back on our big float coat. She took my bear spray and is standing in front of me with the 2 cans of bear spray, one in each hand. I'm waving my arms, but we got our backpacks back on, so we look much huger than we are. And I'm trying to radio back to the Zodiac to alert them that we are being charged by a very fast bear. And it really took the time to get the bear spray out, get on the radio, get our float coats on, and the bear was already on our side. And we're kind of frantically waving our arms to scare the bear. And it stopped kind of right below us on the beach and then changed directions and just ran across the island. So it was still on the island we were on, but pretty far from us at that point, and just running. And I think what really impressed me about that is there's a reason they tell you not to run because bears are really, really fast.
Oh, yeah, they're fast.
We looked later that day to see how close we were, and we figure about 30 yards away from before the bear turned direction. So yeah, that was quite wild for my first experience in Alaska. And Lee just had a super level head about it all and knew exactly what to do. And I had bear training, but an encounter with a bear was quite a different story.
Oh, sure. So then what happened with the polar bear?
Well, the polar bear is just a great story. I was up on the north slope of Alaska, Utqiagvik, and my field assistant for this trip was actually Jessica Meir, who's a NASA astronaut. She was part of the all-women spacewalk. And I had met Jessica in graduate school, and she was at a conference as a speaker after she became an astronaut and kind of lamenting to me that the doctors and the fighter pilots, they get to continue their professional development once they become an astronaut. But for a field biologist or an animal physiologist like Jessica, there aren't as many opportunities. So I said, well, hey, come up to Alaska with me to catch some big Arctic gulls, and I need a field assistant. So she came up with me, and we gave talks about science to a local school. And then on our last day, we were working at a place where whales had been processed just the day before as part of a subsistence hunt. So there was a lot of kind of just little bits of whale remains and blood all over this old field. And that attracted all of the big glaucous gulls. Well, it also attracted the polar bears. And we had our eye on one across the way, and we were getting gear out of the truck. I was at the back of the truck, and Jessica said, get in the truck now. We got back in the truck, slammed the door, and this bear had swum from across the way, and it was hidden to us by a berm that separated us from the Arctic Ocean.
Oh.
So this bear comes up and just out of nowhere right in front of our truck. And we slammed the doors and honked the horn, and heart racing. I realized that my leg was like trembling just a little bit. Like, these bears are big, and there's an astronaut in the truck with me. Yeah, maybe she doesn't want this story told so NASA can hear it. But yeah, Jessica saved me from the polar bear by seeing the polar bear first. And the bear eventually turned around and went back out to the ocean to leave us in peace. But we were all attracted there by the same thing. I'll never forget that one.
Well, Autumn Lynn, I love these stories, and I think they're the perfect examples of just how unexpected surprises come up in the field. And I think these go contrary to a lot of what people envision in terms of life as a scientist. You expect everything to be controlled in a clean lab environment. That's sort of the image that a lot of the public has about what science is like, and it's so not true in many cases. So we love breaking some of these stereotypes by sharing these funny stories, sharing these kind of quirky traditions and human moments that you have as a scientist. So do you have another example of one of these that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, I'm going to tell the story of a lab mate of mine. She's a physiologist. She was in my PhD lab at Santa Cruz, and she's a 6 foot tall, really tough field biologist. But one of the traditions in our lab was to have to work on northern elephant seals, and her name's Melinda Fowler. And the people working on northern elephant seals have these phys kits. They're basically tackle boxes with all of the needles and drugs and equipment that we need to study seals. And Melinda, being the super tough biologist that she is, had sparkly stickers all over the phys kit. And so the tradition was kind of to decorate the phys kit in fun ways. And one day I was out assisting with the elephant seal captures, and Melinda's got her sparkly phys kit. And it turned out that a male elephant seal decided it wanted to charge right through where we had been working. And it ended up running right over the sparkly physiology kit and crushing it into the ground.
Oh, no.
So, yeah, the combination of huge bull elephant seal and some sparkly stickers all over a tackle box is just, that's real science, people.
Right. You can't make that up, yeah? So did you get to decorate your own phys kit?
No, I never became a card-carrying physiologist. So even though I was in a lab with physiologists, but I do put stickers all over my metal clipboards now with data sheets and everything. It's just kind of fun seeing how everyone decorates their field gear.
Oh, that's awesome. I love it. And it's been great to hear more about the real world experiences that you have as a scientist, because as we mentioned, people do have these stereotypes. And I think one of the challenges that you face is not only the public perception of science, but limitations in funding, staff, feasibility, maybe particularly in this area of conservation. So if we took away all of the barriers you normally face, Autumn Lynn, is there one question that you would want to answer most?
Absolutely. I have an easy one. And it came to me after working at the Smithsonian and doing a lot with seabird biology. There was a project in the 1960s led out of the Smithsonian Institution called the Pacific Ocean Biological Survey Program, or POPS. So it's got a long name, but it was funded primarily to study whether seabirds in the Pacific Ocean would be vectors, perhaps, of germ warfare agents. So it was funded by the Department of Defense, but the interest of the Smithsonian was to study bird migration. So this was the first time that there had been a massive banding program for seabirds in any ocean basin. So 1960s, this cadre of biologists, at least 40 different biologists over an 8 to 10 year period, visited all of the U.S. territories and islands of the Pacific Ocean, banded nearly 2 million seabirds, tracked their migrations with these bands, and also took a lot of natural history observations. They did some of the first eradications of invasives on islands that were impacting seabird populations. So quite an amazing study that got shut down very abruptly at the end of the 60s when President Nixon cut the German Biological Agent Research Program of the United States. But as I've been kind of just as side projects, reading through the archives and learning about all this work, all of the biologists that got sent to the study were all men. And there were a couple of women that were involved in leading the logistics and the management. And one woman in particular, Jane Church, probably had a large influence on the program. But all of the field biologists were men. And so if funding were not an option, feasibility, all the logistics that would be entailed, I would just love to recreate that project, really see how things have changed, and maybe have an all-female crew this time, or at least half and half, and see really how these islands have changed in a very systematic way, but using some of the same transects and cruises and island visits that they did in the 1960s. I just think recreating that would be pretty amazing.
That sounds phenomenal. Sounds like a really cool project. And I like this idea of bringing in some diverse perspectives, and wonderful to dream big with you in this show. And I think as a scientist, these problems that you face, whether it's funding, staff, technology, feasibility, are always there. And it can be helpful to have advice to get you through some of those tough times, some of those challenges that you face on a daily basis. So has anyone in your career ever given you a piece of advice that you found really helpful, that really made an impact on your career or helped you get through one of these tough times?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot because I've received so much great advice ranging from family members on up. And I mentioned this earlier, but one piece of advice I got before I embarked on my PhD was to think about it in a professional way. Think about it how I would if I was doing a job and wanted to accomplish a mission. And that was really great advice, I think, that helped me stay sane during my PhD, but even today. And another piece of advice I've gotten as a female scientist, and I've seen different generations come through and kind of adapt to the context the best way they can at the time. But one piece of advice I've gotten over and over again from friends and family and colleagues is just not to lose who I am in the process, and that, maybe I like fashion and maybe I wear heels to the lab sometimes and I wear my Carhartts in the field, but I just don't want to lose sight of the whole person that I am, even as a scientist, and to always remember what kept me passionate about this in the first place. But that whole person mentality, I think, has helped me stay true to myself throughout all of the pressures that science brings.
Well, that is an outstanding message to share with our listeners. I appreciate that and wonderful advice. Is there any other last piece of advice, Autumn Lynn, you'd like to share with our listeners, or an inspirational note you'd like to end our conversation on today?
Yeah, I think that there are ways to maintain your rigor and integrity in science, but still demonstrate enthusiasm and feeling for what you're studying. And that gets back to that idea of just being a whole person. But I really found that I was able to find, first of all, a job in the field that I really loved. So there's inspiration there, but really not to lose what brought you into this in the first place. And if you're excited about something, sharing that excitement is the best way to get any member who's not a scientist of the public to connect with what you're doing. So I think never forgetting the science passion and enthusiasm they have for what you're studying. That's how people are really going to connect with your story.
Autumn Lynn, I think that is such an important point, because I've spoken with scientists who say they're worried about coming across too emotional or coming across too enthusiastic about their work, because they are concerned about people not seeing them as an authority or not taking them seriously. But I think there is absolutely a way to do it in a way that captivates people and kind of draws them in and makes them want to learn more about your work.
Yes, and I definitely have been accused of being too excited, and being only 5'3", I've found that when I'm in a member of a field team and we interact with the public, they'll typically go to either the man or the taller person in the group. And that may not be the person that's leading the team. So that can be a little frustrating sometimes, that you're not always taken seriously as a scientist for whatever reason. Everyone has their own challenges in that way. And I just decided I have to be who I am, and I don't want to really change who I am. And that is someone who's really excited about studying animal migration and conserving migratory species.
Absolutely. Well, Autumn Lynn, it's been such a pleasure to learn more about you and your work. We really appreciate you joining us and sharing so many insights. If our listeners want to learn more about you and the wonderful work that you're doing, what is the best way for them to do so?
Anyone can follow me on Twitter. My handle is Need Marine. And if you want to learn more about what I do, or are a student that's interested in pursuing a field of study like this, just send me a message and I'll be happy to talk with you.
Excellent. Well, listeners, definitely get connected with Autumn Lynn on Twitter. And Autumn Lynn, it's been such a pleasure to chat with you today. Thank you again so much for sharing part of your story with us.
Thank you, Maria. I really appreciate this invitation. It's been fun.
It's been fun to have you here, and listeners, great to have you here as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science.